A mocking snort broke through the respectful quiet of the yearly Armed Forces celebration. Colonel Alistair Finch, his chest covered with medals from years of military service, stared at a single person standing near the room's back. His voice, usually powerful and commanding, now carried an unmistakable tone of ridicule. He started speaking, a smirk crossing his face, questioning who had arrived wearing such an outfit. Every head turned to look. The target of his contempt was a woman, likely in her late 20s, standing with calm pride despite the sudden harsh spotlight of everyone's focus. Her military clothing, though clearly official, looked different from what people expected at such an important gathering. She wore a practical uniform, worn but perfectly clean, showing no rank symbols, just a tiny, barely visible patch on her shoulder with a symbol almost nobody recognized. Nervous laughs rippled through the elegant room. Navy admirals in their sharp dress uniforms exchanged confused looks with Army generals in their shiny brass. Younger officers fidgeted awkwardly, uncertain whether to laugh along or defend her. The atmosphere, filled with expensive cologne and polished leather, suddenly crackled with unspoken pressure. The woman, though, didn't waver. She looked straight at the colonel with steady, unshakable calm, her chin lifted just enough to show strength, not rebellion. Her back was perfectly straight, quietly demonstrating training carved deep into her core. The only noise for a moment was quiet chatter, now fading into uncomfortable silence as everyone waited for her answer or maybe her departure. The colonel pushed harder, his voice becoming harsher, asking if she was lost or confused this event for field training. His sharp, cutting words aimed to shame and belittle her. They lingered heavily in the air, creating an awkward void at the heart of the celebration. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you won't miss these real accounts of bravery. And share in the comments where you're watching from today. Her name was Corporal Alara Vance. To most people, especially those just noticing her now, she was simply the woman wearing the unusual uniform. At 29, Alara had a quiet toughness that frequently went unnoticed, overshadowed by the loud confidence of her male peers in a world still learning to fully accept women in combat positions. She wasn't traditionally beautiful. Her features were practical and angular, framed by hair pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense style. Her eyes, however, contained a depth suggesting untold experiences, a toughness built in challenges unknown to most. Alara had served not in grand ceremonies or strategic planning rooms, but in harsh, dusty lands where the risks were always life or death. Her uniform, which caught Colonel Finch's attention, reflected that service, a combat outfit worn and mended but treated with the care of a second skin. It wasn't the polished elegance of the celebration, but it was authentically hers, earned through hard work, injuries, and sacrifices in locations far from this decorated hall. She came to the event as an invited attendee, a quiet presence among the glittering ranks, mainly to support a friend receiving recognition. Her clothing choice wasn't meant to show disrespect, but was a practical choice. This was the only uniform she still had that genuinely felt right. She didn't own fancy dress uniforms, having been honorably released with little ceremony after a mission that ended not in triumph but in a quiet, difficult transition back to regular life. This modest behavior, this quiet strength was frequently misunderstood. To many, especially people like Colonel Finch who judged by appearances and traditional systems, Alara seemed out of place, an intruder. Her absence of visible rank symbols, her simple practical gear among all the ceremony, made her look like an outsider, someone easily dismissed. She carried herself with humble grace, never wanting attention, which only reinforced the idea that she didn't matter, a shadow in the grand display of military achievement. But underneath the quiet surface lived a spirit shaped by extreme hardship. Alara had always been the observer, the listener, the one who acted when others hesitated. She valued the quiet focus of duty over the noise of praise. Her silence wasn't from weakness but from deeply learned discipline, A lesson absorbed in places where every extra sound could mean danger. This dignified silence, however, was now being seen as either ignorance or defiance, feeding the colonel's contempt even more. Nobody in that room, except perhaps a very small number, understood the full story of her background. They saw a young woman in unusual clothing, an apparent violation of proper dress at an event that valued strict rules. They saw someone who, by all visible signs, didn't belong among the decorated elite. But Alara carried her history not as weight, but as an essential part of her identity. The small scar above her left eyebrow, almost hidden by her hairline, silently testified to a moment of fierce bravery, a hint of an untold story. She was a mystery, a puzzle piece that didn't seem to match the grand picture of the evening. In a world celebrating outward glory, Alara Vance represented the quiet, often invisible heroism, forming the real foundation of any fighting force. This quiet strength, this dignified resilience, was exactly why she was so easily underestimated and readily mocked. The real worth of a soldier, after all, isn't always shown in the medals on a dress uniform, but in the spirit that survives long after battle's end. The colonel continued, his voice now a low rumble carrying throughout the hushed room, stating this wasn't a mess hall after tough training. This was a celebration of courage and service. Her clothing, he declared, insulted everyone who earned the right to wear proper attire at such events. The murmuring grew louder, no longer just nervous laughs but whispers of disapproval, a shared agreement with his judgment. Some in the crowd nodded, faces serious, convinced this woman was truly an embarrassment. Alara stayed motionless, her look still steady, though a faint, almost invisible tremor passed through her hand, held loosely before her. It was a flicker of human weakness, quickly controlled. A general from nearby attempted a gentler approach, though his tone still suggested condescension, suggesting perhaps she was someone's guest, and simply misunderstood the dress code. He offered a strained smile, clearly hoping she would apologize and leave. Alara's silence only seemed to frustrate Colonel Finch more. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing, asking if she was unable to speak, or simply believed herself above the rules governing everyone else. His words cracked like a whip across the evening's decorum. The discomfort in the room was thick and suffocating. What would you have done witnessing this public humiliation? A few more people, encouraged by the colonel's aggressive stance, started offering their own disguised insult. Someone muttered loudly that some people just don't understand what formal means. A young lieutenant, eager to impress his superiors, let out a laugh that was quickly stopped by his companion's elbow. The mockery grew sharper when a warrant officer, a strict man known for rigid rule following, pointed directly at Alara's shoulder patch, asking what it was supposed to represent, some amateur costume, questioning if it was even regulation. His voice dripped with scorn, drawing more nervous laughter from younger officers, feeling safe in the group. The patch, showing a stylized hawk gripping a lightning bolt, was indeed unfamiliar to most, further convincing them Alara was a fake. The colonel, seeing the situation turning his way, pressed harder, suggesting she explain her presence before being asked to leave. His tone allowed no argument or escape. He wasn't asking but demanding, his authority unchallenged. Alara finally spoke, her voice surprisingly gentle, yet clear enough to cut through the oppressive silence gripping the room. She began calmly, explaining she was there by invitation and this uniform represented her service. Her simple statement, rather than calming things, seemed to anger Colonel Finch further. He scoffed, face reddening, claiming 30 years of service, and never seeing such an unremarkable uniform at a formal gathering. No ribbons, no medals, no... Was she suggesting she was some kind of secret agent? His sarcasm was thick, meant to belittle and make her seem foolish. The crowd shifted again, their faces changing from nervous amusement to real confusion and pity. They saw a young woman stubbornly defending a weak explanation, making things worse for herself. The whispers intensified, more speculative. Someone whispered she must be confused. Another cruelly suggested maybe she thought she was still deployed, implying mental problem. Alara, for her part, stayed firm. She didn't raise her voice or lose her composure. Her silence, now mixed with her quiet defense, became less about timidity and more about unshakable inner strength. It was a silence that communicated volumes, if only anyone had the wisdom to truly hear. The atmosphere, initially filled with light-hearted conversation, had become heavy with judgment, and Alara, standing alone, bore its full weight. As the uncomfortable scene continued, a few observant people began noticing small details about Vance that challenged the easy story of a misplaced civilian or imposter. Her uniform, though faded, wasn't just clean. It was perfectly pressed with sharper creases than many dress uniforms in the room. It demonstrated discipline, not disorder. On her wrist, barely visible under her sleeve, was a faint, detailed tattoo, showing a stylized trident, not the familiar Navy SEAL symbol but a more ancient, almost tribal version wrapped around a single stark lightning bolt. It was artwork suggesting profound, deeply personal meaning, far from casual decoration. Quiet whispers started among a small group of naval officers, brows wrinkled in thought. The trident symbol in different forms often connected to elite maritime forces, but this particular design was unique, almost secretive. Adding to the quiet mystery, when Alara had briefly shifted her weight earlier, light caught a barely visible scar just under her right earlobe, tracing a thin, jagged line along her jaw. It wasn't a civilian injury. It showed the marks of something earned in a harsh, unforgiving place, evidence of a close call, a life-or-death struggle. It was the kind of scar combat veterans often carried, silent proof of harrowing experiences. And there was the way she held herself. Even under intense examination and open ridicule, her posture never faltered. Her shoulders were strong, her stance grounded, a subtle balance hinting at years of carrying heavy equipment, of staying ready in dangerous situations. It was the stance of someone constantly prepared, sharpened by instinct, and demanding training, not the casual ease of an ordinary person. One elderly, respected Air Force general, watching from a shadowed area, squinted through his glasses. He had seen that type of posture before in places far from Washington's gilded halls. He had met soldiers carrying themselves with that same combination of quiet confidence and hidden power, often the ones who faced the most brutal tests. He made a mental note to ask about her later. There was also the small, dull metal pin attached to her uniform jacket's lapel, almost hidden by the fold. It wasn't a conventional medal, not one of the brightly polished awards typically shown. It was a simple, tarnished coin, slightly larger than a quarter, marked with a single word in an unfamiliar script, almost ancient-looking, alongside another faint, unidentifiable symbol. It wasn't designed for public showing or recognition, but seemed to be a personal keepsake, held close, containing a story only its owner truly knew. As Colonel Finch continued his attack, blind to these subtle signs, the young lieutenant who had laughed earlier leaned toward his companion, whispering to look at that shoulder patch again. It looked vaguely familiar, like something from an old classified briefing he'd once seen, though he couldn't quite remember it. His companion shrugged, more interested in the drama than details. These weren't obvious red flags, not clear clues screaming for attention. They were subtle whispers in the visual symphony of the celebration, only catching the notice of those with sharp eyes, those who understood the unspoken language of military service and its permanent marks. They suggested a story far deeper, far more complicated than the simple narrative of an out-of-place woman. The mystery of Alara Vance was slowly, almost invisibly, beginning to reveal itself, hinting at a truth that would soon shock everyone. Colonel Finch, now fully committed to his verbal attack, paused to take a triumphant sip of champagne, clearly expecting Alara to finally break under the weight of his contempt. Still nothing to say, he sneered, a superior smile spreading across his face, suggesting perhaps she should consider a career where her fashion choices wouldn't be so disruptive. It was at this exact moment, as the tension reached its peak, that Alara Vance did something so small yet so completely shocking, it silenced the entire room more effectively than any shouted order. She unclasped the small, tarnished coin from her lapel. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, a smooth economy of motion, demonstrating muscle memory, of actions repeated countless times under pressure. She didn't offer it to the colonel or hold it up for examination. Instead, she simply turned it over in her palm, revealing the other side. On this side, carved with remarkable precision, was a single stark word, Resolute. Beneath it, a series of coordinates 34 degrees north, 67 degrees east. The coordinates weren't random. They marked a remote, desolate area in Afghanistan, infamous for some of the most brutal and secret operations of the past 20 years. A place where Resolute wasn't just a word, but a mission code name, a whisper in the darkest corners of intelligence meetings. Colonel Finch's triumphant smile disappeared, his eyes fixed on the coin, widening almost imperceptibly. He had seen that code name before in highly classified documents, in the aftermath reports of operations, so sensitive they were barely acknowledged even within the highest levels of command. But the real shock came when someone emerged from the edge of the crowd, a man who had been watching the entire exchange with growing concern. He was a tall, powerfully built individual, in a pristine Navy SEAL dress uniform, the rank of lieutenant commander displayed on his shoulder. He had arrived late, slipping in quietly, and had been standing toward the back, his expression unreadable. When he saw the coin, specifically the coordinates and the word Resolute, a flicker of recognition, then amazement crossed his face. He took a single deliberate step forward. The lieutenant commander's voice was deep, authoritative, cutting through the thick silence like a blade. He wasn't addressing Alara but Finch directly, his tone leaving no doubt about his intention. He stated clearly that the colonel owed this soldier an apology. The colonel, still reeling from seeing the coin, snapped his head toward the lieutenant commander, his face mixing anger and confusion, attempting to reassert his authority by asking if the officer forgot whom he was addressing and on what grounds he was interfering with a matter of proper conduct. The lieutenant commander ignored him. His focus was fixed on Alara, and in his eyes there wasn't a trace of scorn but a profound, almost sacred respect. He then did something that stunned the entire room, truly changing the tide of perception. He didn't just walk over, he marched with the crisp, deliberate movements of a man completely certain of his purpose. He stopped directly before Alara, and then, without another word, the Navy SEAL lieutenant commander, a man of immense respect and accomplishment, raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. The gesture wasn't merely a formal acknowledgement, it was a profound act of deference, a silent testimony to a shared, unspoken history. The salute held, maintained with an intensity that communicated volumes. It was a clear, unmistakable signal that this woman, Alara Vance, in her faded practical uniform, commanded not ridicule but the highest respect. The entire room fell into absolute breathless silence. The whispers died. The nervous laughter vanished. Every single eye was now fixed on the scene. An unexpected display of honor amid what had been an uncomfortable spectacle of contempt. The lieutenant commander's salute was a stunning twist that shattered all assumptions, hinting at a truth far more profound than anyone had imagined. It was a silent challenge to Colonel Finch, and a public declaration of Alara's true hidden standing. The lieutenant commander lowered his salute, his eyes still holding Alara's. He then turned slowly, facing Colonel Finch and the gathered officials, his expression serious and determined. He began, his voice carrying the weight of command and a hint of controlled anger, explaining that the uniform worn by Corporal Vance, while not standard dress for this celebration, was a uniform of the highest honor. The patch on her shoulder, the stylized hawk and lightning bolt, that was the insignia of Joint Special Operations Task Force 17, codename Resolute, the unit she served with. A ripple of murmurs, this time of stunned recognition, swept through the room. Joint Special Operations Task Force 17. The name, while not widely known to the public, sent chills through every high-ranking officer present. It was a black operations unit working in the shadows, undertaking missions of unimaginable danger and secrecy. Many had only heard whispers of its existence, its legendary effectiveness, and the extreme vetting required to even be considered for its ranks. The lieutenant commander continued, his voice now lower, filled with raw reverence resonating through the silent room. The coordinates on that coin, 34 degrees north, 67 degrees east, marked the exact location of what was known as Objective Griffin, a mission deep within enemy territory in Helmand Province, where a downed Allied aircraft crew was held captive. a mission deemed suicidal by many, a mission where against all odds, a small team infiltrated, neutralized a fortified enemy compound, and extracted every single survivor. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. The expressions on the generals' and admirals' faces shifted from confusion to dawning horror. They remembered whispers of Griffin, a miraculous extraction that saved dozens of lives, but the details had been so deeply classified, so shrouded in secrecy that few knew the true heroes behind it. The lieutenant commander stated, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, that Corporal Alara Vance wasn't just part of that team. She was the team's primary intelligence and communication specialist. It was her real-time intelligence gathering, her ability to decode enemy communications under fire, and her courageous decision to disable a critical enemy jammer while exposed to direct enemy fire that allowed forces to locate and extract every single captive. Without her, that mission would have failed, and dozens of brave service members would have died. He then looked directly at Alara, profound respect carved on his face. She was the one who, with a single crucial transmission from behind enemy lines, changed the course of that operation from certain disaster to an unprecedented success. Colonel Finch's face, which had been a mask of disdain moments before, was now pale. The snickering junior officers were wide-eyed, mouths open. The woman in the expensive gown who had mocked Alara's fashion choices now looked as though she wished to disappear. The truth, when it finally emerged, hit the room like a physical shockwave. The scar above Alara's eyebrow, the tribal trident tattoo on her wrist, the disciplined posture, all of it suddenly made agonizing sense. These weren't the marks of an imposter but the undeniable badges of a warrior who had faced the true test of combat and emerged, not only victorious, but profoundly changed. The lieutenant commander then reached into his own pocket and produced an identical tarnished coin. He held it up, showing the same word Resolute and the same coordinates. He was a pilot on the extraction team, he said quietly but firmly, and he owed his life and the lives of his crew to Corporal Vance. The room remained utterly silent, except for the faint sound of ice in a forgotten glass. The air, which had been thick with scorn, was now heavy with the weight of revelation, a profound, humbling recognition of true heroism, standing quietly among them. The entire room had been judged and found wanting by a woman they had so carelessly dismissed. The silence that had fallen upon the room after the lieutenant commander's revelation was no longer awkward or filled with judgment. It was a silence of profound awe, a collective intake of breath, as the magnitude of Alara Vance's service sank in. Colonel Finch, utterly shamed, stood rigid, his face showing disbelief, remorse, and dawning respect. The lieutenant commander, whose name was now whispered with newfound reverence, as Lieutenant Commander Miller, turned back to Alara. His voice, though still firm, softened with an almost fatherly admiration, stating it was an honor to stand in her presence. Then, with a deliberate, unhurried motion, he raised his hand once more. But this time, it wasn't just him. Colonel Finch, his earlier arrogance completely shattered, slowly, hesitantly, raised his own hand in a salute. His movements were stiff at first, but then filled with deep, genuine reverence. Then, almost like falling dominoes, a brigadier general, then an admiral, then a major, and then every single uniformed officer in the room, from the most junior lieutenant to the most decorated general, began to stand. One by one they rose from their tables, their movements synchronized by an invisible thread of respect. The clinking of silverware, the hushed conversations, the very air itself seemed to stop. And then, with an almost audible collective breath, they all raised their hands in salute to Corporal Alara Vance. The sight was breathtaking, a sea of polished uniforms, gleaming brass, and rows of ribbons, all offering the highest possible honor to a solitary figure in a faded practical uniform, standing quietly, almost humbly among them. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement that true valor transcended rank, defied expectation, and often resided in the most unexpected places. A few civilians, initially confused, began to grasp the monumental significance of the moment. They too rose, some with tears streaming down their faces, recognizing the profound honor being bestowed. A ripple of applause began, starting softly, then building into a crescendo that shook the very chandeliers of the grand hall. It wasn't just polite applause, it was an eruption of heartfelt appreciation, a spontaneous outpouring of respect for a hero who had gone unrecognized for too long. Alara, overwhelmed but still maintaining her remarkable composure, simply stood there, receiving the wave of honor with the same quiet dignity she had met the earlier ridicule. Her eyes, usually so stoic, shimmered with emotion she quickly brought under control. This was not a moment she had sought, nor one she had ever expected. She was simply a soldier doing her duty. The lieutenant commander then did something else that cemented the emotional peak of the evening. He stepped back, gesturing toward Alara, announcing loudly that this was Corporal Alara Vance, a true hero of the Resolute task force. The applause intensified, a roaring ovation that lasted for what felt like an eternity. The narrative of the evening had flipped entirely. From public humiliation to a goosebump-inducing public coronation of a quiet warrior, the ridicule had transformed into honor so profound, so visceral that it moved many in the room to tears. It was a climax of unexpected respect, a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who serve in the shadows, asking for nothing but giving everything. As the thunderous applause finally began to fade, Alara, now standing amid a sea of saluting officers and tearful civilians, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. She did not bow, nor did she make a grand speech. When Lieutenant Commander Miller approached her again, a respectful smile on his face, he simply extended his hand, stating it was an honor and thanking her for her service. Alara met his gaze, a faint, humble smile finally gracing her lips. "Just doing my duty," she replied, her voice soft but firm, a clear echo of the disciplined soldier she truly was. There was no boasting, no request for further recognition, just the simple, profound statement of a warrior who had acted from conviction, not for praise. Her humility in that moment, after enduring such public scorn, only deepened the respect that now filled the room. Colonel Finch, his face still marked with profound regret, approached her hesitantly. He stood before her, a man stripped of his pride, offering a silent apology through his remorseful eyes. He managed to speak, his voice barely a whisper thick with emotion, saying he was wrong, terribly wrong, offering his deepest apology. Alara simply nodded, her gaze acknowledging his sincerity, offering silent forgiveness without dwelling on the past insult. She understood that sometimes the greatest lessons come through the hardest mistakes. She hadn't sought vindication, only to be allowed to exist with dignity. Her quiet strength, her unyielding resilience in the face of such unwarranted disrespect, served as a powerful reminder to everyone in that room. True courage isn't always loud or flashy. It often resides in the quiet determination of those who serve without fanfare, who endure hardships unseen, and who stand firm in their convictions, even when faced with overwhelming criticism. Their sacrifice is not measured by the medals on their chest, but by the indelible mark they leave on the world and the lives they protect. This story, like so many others that remain untold, reminds us that judgment based on superficial appearances is dangerous foolishness. The uniform, the rank, the outward display of success, these are but symbols. The true heart of a soldier, the unwavering spirit of a veteran, lies in their character, their service, and their willingness to put themselves in harm's way for a cause greater than themselves. Alara Vance taught everyone that night that humility and quiet strength can shine brighter than any polished metal, and that respect, once truly earned, is a force that can shatter even the most entrenched prejudice. Her story is a testament to the fact that heroes walk among us, often in unassuming forms, their valor carved, not in public records, but in the very fabric of their being. It is a story of quiet power, unwavering dignity, and the profound transformative weight of true respect. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.